The day will come when they'll replay your words in their mind and wish to God they had taken notes. Do you know what's worse than being wrong? Realizing you were wrong about the one person who could have saved you from disaster. Studies have shown that the human brain remembers moments of regret with more emotional intensity than even moments of joy. And right now, someone out there is living in a regret loop because they didn't believe you when you spoke the truth. They used to smile politely at your advice, maybe even roll their eyes when you turned your wisdom mode on. But here's the thing about real wisdom. It doesn't age out, it matures like fine wine. And now, while they're choking on the bitter taste of "I should have listened," you're somewhere sipping on the sweet vintage of "I told you so," without even saying it out loud. The suspense in all this, they're not just realizing you were right. They're realizing you were right in a way that makes them wonder if you have a direct line to the universe's cheat codes. And the more they replay your words, the more they see you weren't just guessing, you were knowing. Today, we're breaking down exactly what's happening when people finally connect the dots between your so-called crazy predictions and their now painfully obvious reality, and why that realization is hitting them harder than a plot twist in the final season of their favorite show. Number 1, they're finally seeing the math you solved years ago. They're finally seeing the math you solved years ago, and it's unsettling them in ways they won't admit. You weren't throwing random guesses into the air. You were mapping out the exact sequence of cause and effect that would unfold if they kept making the choices they were making. Back then, it looked to them like you were just overthinking or being dramatic. In reality, you had already run the numbers in your mind, not in formulas and symbols, but in the patterns of human behavior, the way certain attitudes lead to specific outcomes, and how one small decision can set off a chain of events they won't see coming until it's too late. They thought they were ahead of you because they were acting in the moment. But wisdom doesn't live in the moment, it lives ahead of the moment. You had already processed where the road would lead while they were still admiring the scenery at the starting point. The only reason they didn't take you seriously was because they didn't believe anyone could see that far without being lucky or paranoid. What they didn't realize was that you weren't just reading the present, you were reading the future that the present was building. Now, that future is here, and here's the part that stings for them. It unfolded exactly the way you said it would. The same warnings they brushed off are now playing out like a movie they didn't want to see. They can't pretend you were guessing anymore because guessing doesn't land with this much accuracy. You didn't just predict the big events. You called the small details too. The subtle shifts in people's behavior, the way alliances would change, even the way they themselves would feel once reality hit. The real discomfort isn't just that you were right. It's that they now have to face the fact that you are operating from a depth of understanding they didn't even believe existed. That's what really unsettles them. Not your correctness, but the uncomfortable truth that they underestimated the range and sharpness of your mind. And now every time they think about your advice, they can't shake the feeling that they could have avoided all of this if they'd only trusted the math you solved before the equation even showed up on the board. Number 2, their doubt wasn't about you, it was about protecting their illusion. Their doubt was never really about you, it was about protecting the world they had built inside their own minds. You were not rejected because your words lacked sense, logic, or truth. You were rejected because accepting your wisdom would have forced them to dismantle beliefs that kept them comfortable. And for most people, comfort is more valuable than truth. If they admitted you were right, it would mean admitting that the way they'd been living, thinking, or seeing the world was flawed. That's not an easy thing to face because it strips away the illusion of control they've been holding on to. People cling to their illusions like lifelines. They'll defend a lie that feels safe before they embrace a truth that shakes the ground beneath them. When you spoke, you didn't just offer advice. You were handing them a mirror that reflected their blind spots, their habits, and the possible consequences of their choices. That's a dangerous thing to hand someone who isn't ready. It's easier to label you wrong than to face the deep work that would come from accepting you were right. This is why your words didn't land back then. They weren't in a place where they could afford to lose the comfort of their narrative. They wanted to keep seeing themselves as wise, in control, and making the best decisions. Your truth threatened all of that. You weren't attacking their intelligence, but to them it felt like you were. Because if you had the kind of clarity you showed them, what did that say about their own ability to see? Now that time has peeled away their illusions, they're forced to confront what they avoided. They can't rewrite the past to make it seem like they didn't hear you clearly. They remember exactly what you said, and they remember how they dismissed it. And this is where the regret creeps in. It's not just about ignoring good advice. It's about realizing they silenced the one voice that could have saved them from a lot of unnecessary pain. They didn't doubt you because you lacked wisdom. They doubted you because accepting your wisdom would have cost them their illusion, and they weren't ready to pay that price. Now the cost of ignoring you has turned out to be far greater. Number 3, your accuracy left no room for their denial to hide. Your accuracy left no room for their denial to hide. They could ignore your tone, dismiss your delivery, and even mock the confidence you spoke with, but the facts didn't care about their feelings. Every word you spoke lined up with reality in a way that was too sharp to be coincidence. At first they told themselves you were just lucky. Anyone could stumble onto a correct guess now and then. But when it kept happening, when each point you made unfolded exactly as you described, that excuse started to collapse. They wanted to find loopholes in your track record, little cracks they could point to as proof that you weren't as sharp as you seemed, but there were no cracks. Even when you were off by a detail or two, the core truth still landed exactly where you said it would. That's the kind of consistency you can't fake. And consistency is dangerous to people who want to keep doubting you, because it slowly corners them until the only way to keep ignoring you is to deliberately lie to themselves. The more the truth unfolded, the more uncomfortable they became. Not because the events themselves were shocking, but because your accuracy exposed the fact that they could have avoided so much if they'd listened. You didn't just see the obvious. You saw the things they couldn't even imagine at the time. And now, every reminder of your correctness feels like a personal reminder of their own stubbornness. This is why some people grow quiet around you now. It's not respect, it's avoidance. They know if they keep engaging with you, they'll eventually have to acknowledge that you saw things they didn't, and they can't hide behind "nobody could have known" anymore. You knew, you told them, and they ignored it. The truth is, your accuracy didn't just predict events, it exposed character. It showed who was willing to listen, who was too proud, and who was only loyal to their own version of reality. That's why it stings so much now. It's not just about the fact that you were right. It's about the fact that your being right meant they were wrong, and there's no longer anywhere for that denial to go. Number 4, wisdom is expensive. They couldn't afford the cost at the time. Wisdom has always had a price tag, but it's not one you pay in money. The currency is humility, and back when you spoke to them, they simply couldn't afford it. They weren't ready to admit they didn't have all the answers, because doing so would have meant stepping down from the pedestal they'd built for themselves. That pedestal wasn't made of truth. It was made of pride, ego, and the belief that they were already equipped to handle whatever life threw at them. Your words were like a bill they weren't prepared to pay, so they left it sitting on the table and walked away. The problem is, ignoring wisdom doesn't erase the debt. Life still collects, just in a different way. Every choice they made without the benefit of your insight carried interest, and over time, that interest grew. One wrong decision led to another. Small cracks became deep fractures. And soon the weight of those mistakes was too heavy to ignore. Only then, crushed under the consequences, did they start to understand the value of what you were offering back then. When you spoke, you weren't just giving them random advice. You were handing them a shortcut to avoid the very pain they've now experienced. But in their minds, Taking your advice would have meant surrendering their pride, and pride is one of the most expensive things to maintain. It keeps you paying for mistakes long after you could have been free from them. Now that they've paid their debt through the hard way, they can finally see the truth. Wisdom was never out of their reach. They just didn't want to pay the price of listening. And, ironically, the cost of ignoring you turned out to be far greater than the cost of humility would have been. They could have learned through guidance, but instead they had to learn through loss. This is why their respect for you now feels so different. It's not casual acknowledgement. It's the kind of respect that comes from understanding the value of something only after losing the chance to use it when it mattered most. They weren't ready to afford your wisdom then, but life made sure they paid for it anyway. Number 5. Your silence wasn't absence. It was evidence of self-mastery. Your silence was never a sign that you had nothing to say. It was a sign that you didn't need to say anything more. You weren't trying to win points or prove yourself in a debate because you understood something they didn't. Real wisdom doesn't beg to be heard, and it certainly doesn't audition for someone's acceptance. Once you had spoken your truth, you let it stand on its own. You didn't chase them down to convince them. You didn't raise your voice to outshout their doubts, and you didn't water it down to make it easier for them to digest. That kind of composure is rare, and it shook them more than if you had kept arguing. In their world, disagreement usually meant escalation. They were used to people defending themselves frantically, scrambling to prove they were right. But you didn't give them that satisfaction. You didn't get dragged into circles of back and forth because you knew that arguing with a closed mind is like pouring water on a locked safe. Nothing gets in. You trusted time to do the revealing, and that kind of patience can be unnerving to people who thrive on reaction. The unsettling part for them wasn't just that you stayed silent, it was how you stayed silent. You didn't look defeated, bitter, or desperate to be believed. You looked steady, like someone who already knew how the story would end. That calm confidence acted like a mirror, forcing them to confront their own insecurity. Deep down, they sense that anyone who can walk away from an argument without needing to be validated is operating from a level of certainty they can't touch. When the truth eventually played out exactly as you said, your silence gained weight in their memory. It stopped being "you had nothing to say" and became "you didn't need to say it twice." And now, when they think about those moments, the lack of defense on your part speaks louder than any argument could have. You didn't just hold your tongue, you held your ground. And in the end, that quiet restraint became the proof that you never needed to chase. Number 6. The proof hit them in a language they couldn't ignore. Reality. The proof didn't come to them in your words anymore. It came in a language they couldn't escape. Reality. You had already told them what was coming, laid out the risks, and even gave them the tools to avoid it, but back then, your words were easy to dismiss. They could laugh, roll their eyes, or brush you off as being too serious. That was simple to do when the consequences were still theoretical. But theory has a way of becoming real, and life made sure they got the translation in a way they could no longer ignore. When the very scenarios you described started happening to them, there was no way to hide behind pride anymore. The details matched too closely, the sequence too precise for them to call it coincidence. They didn't have to imagine the fallout you warned them about. They were standing in the middle of it. And suddenly the same advice that once felt unnecessary became a lifeline. They started replaying your words in their mind, not as something to dismiss, but as something to follow. That shift from disbelief to dependence didn't happen because they wanted to give you credit. It happened because survival leaves no room for arrogance. When life corners you, you grab onto whatever can keep you afloat, and in their case, it was the very wisdom they once treated like a joke. The rules you gave them, the perspective you offered, they became their manual for getting through situations they never thought they'd face. What they can't easily admit now is how much that realization stings. It's not just that you were right. It's that they could have avoided so much struggle if they had listened sooner. They had access to the same guidance they're now treating like gold, but they were too sure of themselves to take it seriously. Life, however, doesn't care about ego. Will teach the lesson one way or another. And so, here they are living out the very truth they once rejected. They may not tell you outright, but they know deep down that reality didn't just prove you right. It made your voice unforgettable. Because once life speaks in that language, there's no going back to pretending they didn't hear you. Number 7. They measured you by their limited standards and got a false reading. They measured you by the only yardstick they had, their own limited experience. And because of that, they got you all wrong. They weren't evaluating your insight based on its depth or accuracy. They were judging it through the narrow lens of what they had lived, seen, and understood. If your wisdom didn't match the scale of their world, they assumed it was exaggerated or unrealistic. But the truth is, when someone has only known a shallow stream, they'll struggle to comprehend the vastness of an ocean. This is why your perspective didn't register as valid to them at first. They couldn't reconcile how you could see so far ahead or understand layers of complexity they didn't even know existed. In their mind, if they couldn't see it, it couldn't be there. And that's where the miscalculation began. Instead of expanding their perception to match what you were showing them, they shrank your truth to fit the boundaries of their comfort zone. The danger in this kind of thinking is that it blinds people to anything beyond their current horizon. They don't realize that their inability to see what you see says nothing about your accuracy and everything about their limitations. They assumed they were making a fair assessment, but in reality they were like someone trying to measure an entire coastline with a ruler. The method itself guaranteed an incomplete reading. Now that life has widened their perspective through experience, they can see how flawed that first judgment was. They've encountered situations that make them think back to your words and realize you weren't overreaching. You were simply speaking from a level of understanding they hadn't reached yet. The so-called exaggerations they dismissed now look like understatements. This is the quiet truth that humbles them. Their inability to comprehend your insight had nothing to do with your credibility and everything to do with the smallness of their frame of reference at the time. You weren't wrong, their measuring tool was. And now, with a larger view of the world, they can finally see that your wisdom wasn't too big. It was their lens that was too small. Number 8. You spoke from timeless insight they heard through temporary fear. You were speaking from a place that wasn't bound by the panic of the moment. Your words came from timeless insight, understanding drawn from experience, spiritual clarity, and patterns that repeat through history. You weren't reacting to the noise around you. You were anchored in something bigger, something steady, but they weren't hearing you from that place. They were hearing you through the filter of temporary fear. And fear is one of the worst translators of truth. When people are afraid, they don't process information to understand. They process it to protect themselves from whatever feels threatening. That means even the clearest truth can get twisted into something it was never meant to be. Your wisdom was meant to prepare them, guide them, and give them perspective, but their fear distorted it into exaggeration, criticism, or even doomsaying. In their state, anything that challenged their sense of safety felt like an attack, even if it was actually an act of care. That gap between your source and their reception meant the message was always going to land differently than you intended. It's not that they didn't hear the words, they just didn't hear the truth within them. They filtered your insight through their anxiety, and anxiety edits out the parts that require calm reflection. They weren't ready to hear without defending themselves, so they reduced your long-view perspective into something small and urgent. But time has a way of clearing the noise. Once the fear that clouded their thinking finally played itself out, once the situation unfolded and the dust settled, your words came back to them, untouched by the panic that had distorted them before. Now they could see that you weren't trying to scare them. You were trying to steady them. You weren't just reacting to the moment. You were speaking to the bigger picture they couldn't see yet. What they realize now is that your insight was never about the crisis they were obsessing over. It was about the truth beneath it. the patterns that remain constant no matter what's happening in the present. Only with the fear gone can they finally hear the unedited version of your truth. And it sounds nothing like the distorted version they thought they heard back then. Number 9. Regret is the tax they pay for ignoring you. Regret is the bill that shows up when you ignore wisdom. And for them, it's a tax they'll keep paying long after the moment is past. They can't rewind the clock and accept what you told them when it could have changed the outcome. That window is gone, and now the only thing left is the dull, relentless sting of, "I should have listened." It's not the kind of pain that explodes all at once. It's the quiet kind that lingers, creeping into their thoughts when they least expect it. What makes this tax so heavy is that it's avoidable. They had the opportunity to take your insight seriously, to apply it, and to sidestep the exact struggles they ended up facing. But in the moment, they thought they had more time, more leeway, or better judgment. They believed they could handle it on their own terms. That belief was expensive, and the payment came in the form of sleepless nights, hard lessons, and emotional tolls they didn't budget for. Regret is also a constant reminder that the loss wasn't just about what they went through, it's about what they missed out on. They'll never know the version of their life that could have existed if they had trusted your words. That uncertainty alone eats away at them because it forces them to admit that their own pride or doubt closed a door that might never open again. The hardest part is that this tax doesn't have an end date. Once regret settles in, it resurfaces again and again. Every time a similar situation comes up, every time they see someone else take the advice they ignored and succeed, every time life reminds them of the moment they shrugged you off, even if they grow from the lesson, the awareness of what they could have avoided never fully disappears. In the end, regret is proof that wisdom is cheaper when you take it early. They didn't pay in humility when they had the chance, so now they're paying in hindsight. And no matter how much they wish it were different, they can't go back and erase the bill, only keep paying the tax for as long as memory keeps the record. Number 10. They're realizing your wisdom wasn't just about situations, it was about survival. They're finally realizing your wisdom was never just about giving them a better strategy for handling situations. It was about keeping them alive, whole, and intact in environments they didn't realize were dangerous. Back then, they thought your words were just thoughtful opinions, maybe even overly cautious takes. They saw them as tools to help navigate disagreements, make smoother choices, or come out looking better in a social or personal dispute. But the depth of your guidance went far beyond that. You weren't trying to make them win in the eyes of people. You were trying to keep them from losing in ways that would cost them more than pride. When you spoke, you were addressing risks they couldn't see. You were aware of undercurrents, hidden motives, subtle manipulations, and long-term consequences that weren't obvious to someone walking into a situation blindly. While they thought they were stepping into harmless territory, you knew the ground was layered with traps. Your advice was crafted to protect them from more than just mistakes. It was meant to guard their mind, their dignity, their reputation, and sometimes even their safety. The truth is, most people don't recognize danger until they're staring it in the face. By then, it's too late to avoid it. They can only try to escape. You were giving them the chance to never even reach that point, but because the threats weren't visible to them yet, they mistook your foresight for exaggeration or fear-mongering. They didn't realize you were speaking from a vantage point where the stakes were much higher than they assumed. Now that they've lived through situations that cut deeper than they imagined, they can finally see your guidance for what it was, a survival code. It wasn't about helping them look smart or win a debate. It was about keeping them from being in the kind of positions where looking smart doesn't matter, because the damage is already done. That's why their respect for your wisdom feels different now. It's not casual acknowledgement. It's the quiet understanding that you were just right. You were protecting them from battles they didn't even know they were walking into, and survival they now know as the highest form of winning. Number 11. Your insight threatened the power of their comfort zone. Your insight wasn't rejected because it lacked truth. It was rejected because it threatened the power they held inside their comfort zone. People talk about wanting growth, but growth requires expansion. An expansion means stepping into territory where they're no longer the expert, no longer in control, no longer certain of every outcome. That's a terrifying place for someone who has built their sense of safety on being in charge of their familiar little world. When you spoke, your words carried an invitation to see bigger, think broader, and operate on a level they hadn't explored before. But the moment they even considered accepting that invitation, it meant acknowledging that their current understanding wasn't the full picture. That meant surrendering the false power that comes from being right in a small, controlled space. For some people, losing that power feels worse than facing the truth. It's easier to stay in the shallow end where they know every corner than to swim into the deep where they might discover just how much they don't know. Your wisdom pulled at the walls of that safe space, showing them that the room they'd built for themselves was actually a cage. And no matter how gilded a cage may be, tearing it open feels like losing stability. That's why they resisted you so strongly. They weren't just disagreeing with your point, they were defending the boundaries that kept their world manageable. If they let your insight in, it would force them to rethink how they live, who they trust, and how they define themselves. That kind of shift takes courage, and courage is something not everyone is ready to give. Now, with hindsight, they can see that the only thing your wisdom ever threatened was their limitation. You weren't trying to take their power, you were trying to expand it. But expansion always comes with uncertainty, and back then uncertainty felt like danger. They chose the safety of being wrong over the risk of being changed. The irony is that life eventually expanded their world anyway, but instead of it happening through guidance, it happened through hard lessons. And now they know the power they were protecting wasn't power at all. It was the comfort of staying small. Number 12. They thought wisdom meant complexity. You showed them its precision. They used to think wisdom was about big words, long explanations, and ideas so complex that only a select few could grasp them. In their minds, if it wasn't wrapped in layers of complication, it couldn't be profound. So when you delivered insight with clarity, cutting straight to the marrow of the truth without all the decorative fluff, they mistook it for oversimplification. They didn't understand that making something clear isn't the same as making it shallow. In fact, the hardest truths are often the simplest ones. But simplicity is a skill most people never master. You had a way of removing the noise and getting to the exact point that mattered. No detours, no filler, no unnecessary theatrics. That kind of precision isn't born from laziness, it's born from deep understanding. You weren't just talking, you were distilling. You took something that could have been tangled in complexity and presented it in a way that could be applied instantly. But because they equated complexity with intelligence, they couldn't recognize that this was actually a higher form of mastery. It's easier to hide behind a wall of complicated words than to stand firmly on a single clear truth. Complexity can impress people in the moment, but clarity has the power to change them. And that's what your insight carried. The ability to cut through confusion so action could follow. At the time, they didn't value that, because they thought wisdom should make them feel overwhelmed before it made sense. Yours didn't overwhelm them, it confronted them. Now that life has shown them the cost of confusion, they see your precision differently. They've experienced how easy it is to get lost in overcomplication, to spend so much time analyzing that they miss the opportunity to act. And they now understand that the reason your wisdom worked is because it gave them something exact to hold on to, not a maze to wander through. What they once dismissed as too simple has proven to be the most durable kind of guidance. Complexity fades when circumstances change, but precision remains true no matter the setting. Only now do they see that the clarity you offered was not the absence of depth. It was depth refined to its purest form. Number 13. Your warnings were an invitation, not a demand. Your warnings were never meant to trap them into obedience. They were an invitation to see further, choose better, and avoid unnecessary pain. You weren't trying to control them. You were giving them a chance to step into a safer, wiser path. That's the thing about real wisdom. It doesn't need to shove its way into someone's life to prove it's right. It simply lays out the truth and leaves the door open. Whether they walk through it is up to them. You understood something they didn't, that forcing someone to accept understanding before they're ready only builds resistance. People guard their autonomy fiercely, and if they feel like they're being cornered into agreement, they'll push back even harder, even if deep down they suspect you're right. That's why you didn't waste energy trying to hammer your point into them. You gave them space to process, to wrestle with it, and, if necessary, to ignore it. That wasn't weakness. It was respect for their free will. In their eyes, your lack of pressure might have looked like indifference, but it was the opposite. You cared enough to let them come to the truth on their own terms, knowing it would mean more to them that way. Wisdom isn't about winning arguments in the moment. It's about planting seeds that can take root when the conditions are right. And you planted yours without trying to dictate when or how they should grow. Now that time has passed and your words have come to life, they can see the strength in your approach. You didn't need to push, because you knew reality would eventually do the proving for you. And when it did, they wouldn't just remember what you said. They'd remember that you gave them the dignity of choice. This is what unsettles them most now. You could have tried to force them. You could have demanded they see things your way, but you didn't. You let them choose, even if that choice led to mistakes. And because of that, when they finally saw you were right, it wasn't out of submission. It was out of their own realization. That's the kind of wisdom that doesn't just get remembered. It gets respected. Number 14. They see now that you are speaking from the future. They're standing in. They see now that you weren't making guesses or playing fortune teller. You were speaking from a reality that was already clear to you. To them, it sounded like imagination, speculation, or even exaggeration. But to you, it was as real as recalling something you had already lived through. The only difference was that they hadn't caught up to that moment in time yet. When you spoke, you weren't predicting in the way most people think of predictions. You were simply describing the natural outcome of patterns you recognized instantly. It's like reading the final chapter of a book before someone else even finishes the first page. You weren't seeing with just your eyes. You were seeing with understanding, and understanding moves faster than experience. They thought you were seeing ahead, but in truth, you were speaking from the future they were inevitably walking toward. Back then, it was easy for them to brush you off because the reality you described didn't yet exist in their world. They have no frame of reference for it, so it felt far-fetched. But now, they're standing in that very reality, and the accuracy of your words is hitting them with full force. They can trace the steps from where they were to where they are now, and it matches exactly what you laid out. What unsettles them even more is the realization that you weren't stressed or frantic when you spoke those truths. You didn't sound like someone guessing or hoping to be right. You spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had already been there. That calmness is only now making sense to them. It wasn't indifference. It was the steadiness that comes from already knowing the ending. The hardest part for them to process is this. If you were this accurate about what they'd face, what else have you said that they haven't yet experienced, but will? It makes them revisit your words with a new kind of weight, because now they know you weren't just talking. You were reporting from a point in time they hadn't reached yet. And in a way, that makes your past advice feel like instructions sent from their own future. At the heart of it all, the truth is simple. They didn't see you then because they couldn't see that far. Your wisdom wasn't just words, it was a map. It showed them turns they didn't think existed, dangers they couldn't yet detect, and destinations they weren't ready to believe in. They judged it through the lens of their own limits, dismissed it to protect their illusions, and underestimated it because it didn't fit their narrow definitions of smart. But time has a way of stripping away the noise. Every situation they've walked through since has been a quiet confirmation of what you told them. Each consequence became its own translator, turning your warnings into lived experience. And now, Whether they admit it out loud or not, they know you weren't guessing. You were speaking from a depth they couldn't measure, from a place beyond the moment they were in. What unsettles them most now isn't just that you were right. It's that you were consistently right, in ways that felt impossible at the time. They're realizing you never aimed to win arguments or prove them wrong. You aimed to keep them alive, intact and unshaken in a world they underestimated. You gave them clarity when they thought wisdom had to be complicated. You offered them choice when you could have demanded compliance. And you stood silent when you could have chased validation. Because you knew time would do the proving for you. Now they stand in the reality you once described as if you'd already been there. And the truth is, you had. That's why your words still echo in their minds. Not as something they heard once, but as something they'll keep hearing for the rest of their lives. They can't undo the moments they ignored you, but they'll never again mistake your insight for anything less than what it is. A rare, unshakable kind of knowing. Because wisdom doesn't just survive doubt, it survives time. And now they finally know that yours will outlast them both. If this message hit home for you, don't just keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss